July 12, 1944 was an ordinary summer day in California, or so Unteroffizier Klaus Becker thought. He sat in the back of a U.S. Army truck, the wheels crunching over dusty roads, each mile stretching his nerves tighter. The guards remained silent, giving no clue where they were taking him or the other prisoners. He had been told stories of American cruelty, of harsh treatment, of men disappearing into the night never to return. And yet, somewhere beneath the nervous chatter of his fellow POWs, a strange scent wafted through the air. Salt, the unmistakable smell of the ocean. He had never seen it before, not in postcards, not in photos. To Klaus, the world he had known was about to collide with something entirely unexpected. Across the United States, more than 425,000 German prisoners of war had been held during the conflict, yet few knew what awaited them in America. California alone had over 100 POW camps, more than any other state, carefully constructed to house thousands of soldiers far from the battlefields of Europe. The camps followed the Geneva Convention strictly, often offering food rations identical to those of American soldiers. Klaus had imagined starvation, forced labor, and relentless discipline. What he did not imagine was the possibility of kindness, of being treated like a human being rather than a conquered enemy. The truck wound along coastal highways, each turn bringing the roar of the Pacific closer, until suddenly the forest of eucalyptus and chaparral opened to reveal an expanse of shimmering blue. The prisoners fell silent, their eyes wide as the sunlight danced on waves crashing against the shore. Some instinctively shielded their eyes, afraid it was a trick, a trap waiting for them just beyond the sand. Others could not tear their gaze away, mesmerized by the endless horizon. For many, including Klaus, this was the first time they had ever seen the ocean. Rumors had spread among the prisoners that Americans were violent and merciless, but the scene before them challenged every expectation. The guards stepped aside, motioning for the POWs to move closer. Some hesitated, hearts pounding with a mix of fear and curiosity. Then the first men ventured onto the sand, toes sinking into warm grains, the salt spray cooling their sunburned faces. It was a moment of disbelief. They had been trained to see enemies in every gesture, every word, yet here was an invitation, not a threat. As they stood on the shore, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were not being punished. They were not under threat. They were, for the first time in months, allowed to breathe freely, to feel sunlight on their faces without fear. This simple act, walking along the beach, marked the beginning of a profound transformation. These soldiers, conditioned to hate, began to question everything they had been told about the Americans. Could it be that their enemies were not monsters? Could humanity survive even amidst war? The truck ride that had begun with tension and dread ended with a horizon stretching into possibility. Klaus Becker, along with hundreds of others, would carry the memory of this day for the rest of his life. The shock, the disbelief, and the unexpected kindness planted a seed of doubt that would grow into understanding. What they would learn over the coming months in California's POW camps would change not just their lives, but in many ways the relationship between nations and the idea of what it truly means to be treated as human. The Pacific Ocean stretched before them like a vast, uncharted world. Klaus Becker and the other prisoners had never seen anything like it. The waves crashed relentlessly against the shore, each one leaving behind a frothy trail, white against the deep blue. The sunlight reflected off the water in dazzling patterns, blinding in its brilliance. For soldiers trained to expect hardship, fear, and cruelty at every turn, the sight was almost too much to comprehend. They were led down the sandy dunes, still uncertain whether this was a test or some form of deception. In their minds, America had been painted as a place of harsh discipline, where prisoners were starved, beaten, or pushed to the edge. Stories circulated among them of camps where life was unbearable, of enemies who thrived on punishment. But the reality that greeted them at the beach was entirely different. The guards smiled, gestured to the water, and even offered fresh fruit and bottled water. For many, it felt like stepping into a dream, one they could not immediately trust. Some soldiers tentatively dipped their toes into the cool waves. Shock rippled through them as the water was neither dangerous nor a trap. The Pacific was cold but refreshing, invigorating after the months of confinement and rationed food. Laughter began to spread quietly among the prisoners. It was cautious at first, hesitant, as if the sound itself might be punished. Then a few bold men waded deeper, letting the waves crash against their chests. The laughter grew, tentative joy turning into something almost surreal. The prisoners were beginning to see Americans not as enemies, but as human beings. For many, the beach offered more than a moment of recreation. It was an education in contradiction. The ideology they had been raised on, that Americans were weak, indulgent, and morally corrupt, crumbled beneath the reality of kindness, order, and generosity. Meals were better than anything they had eaten in years, fresh bread, fruit, and milk replacing the dry rations and scarcity of war. The contrast was jarring. Some prisoners even began keeping mental notes, astonished by the discipline and respect with which the camp was run. The beach also revealed small acts of trust that spoke louder than any words. Guards allowed prisoners to move freely along the shoreline, gave them towels, and offered guidance for swimming safely. There was no ridicule, no mockery, no violence. These gestures, seemingly simple, carried enormous weight for men whose entire worldview had been built on fear and propaganda. Each wave that washed over their feet carried away a fragment of prejudice, replaced with curiosity, awe, and slowly, understanding. Klaus watched his fellow soldiers, some stiff and hesitant, others diving into the surf with abandon, realizing that what they were experiencing could not be explained by luck or chance. The United States, the enemy they had been taught to despise, was capable of something they had never imagined: generosity, respect, humanity. For many, it was a shock to the system, a moment of cognitive dissonance so profound it would linger long after the waves receded. By the time the sun began to lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water, the prisoners felt something they had not felt in months: freedom, even if only for a few hours. The Pacific Ocean had become more than a body of water. It was a symbol of the unexpected, a reminder that the world was not as black and white as propaganda had insisted. Klaus Becker and thousands like him would carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. The ocean had shown them a reality far different from the stories they had been told, and it was a lesson they could never unlearn. Life behind the fences of California's POW camps was a world entirely apart from the battlefields of Europe. For Klaus Becker and thousands of other German soldiers, the first days were filled with disbelief. The camps were orderly, clean, and surprisingly spacious, a stark contrast to the crowded, chaotic conditions they had endured at the front. Wooden barracks lined neatly in rows, each with bunk beds, blankets, and small personal spaces. Showers were hot, toilets were plentiful, and medical care was available whenever needed. It was, in many ways, unthinkable. Food quickly became one of the most shocking aspects of camp life. The prisoners had been told to expect starvation or barely edible rations, yet here they received meals equivalent to what American soldiers ate. Breakfasts included eggs, bread, and butter. Lunches were fresh meat with vegetables. Dinners often came with fruit and milk. Some prisoners gained 40 to 60 pounds during their months in captivity.
The idea that the enemy could treat them so well challenged every belief they had about Americans. For Klaus, each meal was both a delight and a puzzle. How could someone who was supposed to be cruel provide so much care? Daily routines combined work and recreation, but even labor was humane. Prisoners helped with agricultural work, maintained camp facilities, or assisted in local industries under careful supervision. The work was purposeful, not punitive, and the guards encouraged cooperation rather than obedience through fear. In many ways, the prisoners learned new skills they had never imagined acquiring in captivity. Some discovered carpentry or farming, while others found they enjoyed the responsibility and structure of their assigned tasks. These small victories of competence and trust further dismantled the mental image of the cruel, unyielding American enemy. Recreation became another unexpected element of camp life. Sports fields were available, and prisoners played soccer, volleyball, and even organized small theatrical performances. Music and games filled the evenings, and newspapers from outside the camp were often made available, allowing prisoners to stay connected to the world they had left behind. For many, these activities created a sense of normalcy, a glimpse of life beyond war. Friendships formed, laughter echoed through the barracks, and in quiet moments, soldiers began to reflect on their own beliefs, sometimes questioning the propaganda they had been fed for years. Medical care was another aspect that stood out. Sick or injured prisoners were treated promptly and with respect. Doctors and nurses were attentive, providing medicines, bandages, and even counseling when needed. This level of care was unimaginable for many who had faced death and suffering daily in Europe. The simple act of being seen as a human being, not merely an enemy soldier, carried enormous weight. It was a lesson in dignity, a quiet but powerful message that even in war, humanity could prevail. Interactions with American guards further solidified this sense of dissonance. While strict rules existed, harsh punishment was rare. Guards often engaged in conversation, offered guidance, and occasionally shared small gestures of kindness, a pack of cigarettes, advice on swimming, or a friendly nod. The prisoners were beginning to realize that the Americans' treatment was not an anomaly or a temporary show. It was policy, carefully designed to follow the Geneva Convention and embrace it in spirit as well as law. These daily experiences reshaped perceptions. Men who had expected hostility found camaraderie, understanding, and in many cases genuine care. Klaus Becker, observing his fellow soldiers laugh, play, and eat well, began to feel a strange mix of gratitude and confusion. Could it be possible that the enemy was also capable of kindness? Could the same nation that was said to be brutal, corrupt, and decadent actually embody fairness, compassion, and discipline? By the end of the first month, most prisoners had settled into a rhythm. Fear and suspicion gave way to curiosity and cautious trust. Daily life at the camp was a revelation, a lesson in humanity delivered quietly but insistently through food, work, recreation, and respect. For Klaus Becker and countless others, the realization was profound. Captivity could be more than punishment. It could be a place of learning, reflection, and even transformation. The California camps were not just shelters, they were classrooms, teaching lessons that no battlefield could ever provide, and reshaping the minds of those who had been trained to see only enemies.
Time has a way of revealing truths that initial impressions cannot. For Klaus Becker and the other German prisoners, the months spent in California camps slowly began to reshape their understanding of what it meant to be treated like a human being. At first, moments of kindness, the warm meals, the chance to swim in the Pacific, the respectful words of guards, felt almost surreal, as though they were witnessing a world that existed only in stories. Yet, as days turned into weeks, these acts became ordinary, and the extraordinary nature of their treatment slowly sank in. It was in the small, unguarded moments that the transformation was most profound.
Prisoners who had been trained to see Americans as weak, indulgent, or morally corrupt began to notice patterns of discipline and fairness. When disagreements arose among the POWs, guards often mediated with calm authority rather than force. Complaints about work, meals, or living conditions were heard and addressed. This level of respect, combined with consistent fair treatment, was something most had never experienced, and it left a mark deeper than any conversation could. Friendships started to form, first tentatively, then more openly. The POWs found themselves talking to Americans, learning their names, discovering shared interests, and sometimes even laughing together. Soccer matches became more than games. They were moments of camaraderie that broke down invisible walls. Some prisoners realized that the people they had been taught to hate were not so different from themselves. This realization did not come easily. Cognitive dissonance tugged at their beliefs, forcing them to reconcile years of ideology with the reality before them. Letters sent back home told a different story than the one circulated in Germany. Soldiers wrote of beaches, of warm meals, of courteous guards. They hesitated at first, knowing that sharing these experiences might invite suspicion or ridicule. Yet the truth persisted, and the more they lived in the camps, the more they had to confront their own assumptions. Slowly, ideology that had once seemed unshakable began to bend under the weight of lived experience. Even discipline in the camps carried lessons in humanity. Work was assigned with purpose, not punishment. Mistakes were corrected patiently, not punished harshly. Every act of care, every gesture of trust sent the prisoners a clear message. You are not a mere enemy to be broken. You are a person capable of growth, learning, and respect. The psychological impact was immense. Men who had expected hostility learned to trust, learned to cooperate, and in some cases learned to hope for a future beyond the war. The beach, again and again, became a symbol of this transformation. Many POWs recalled the first time they felt the Pacific waves on their skin as a turning point. It was a moment where ideology collided with reality, and reality won. Those who had been conditioned to see enemies everywhere began to see the Americans as people, complex, sometimes flawed, but capable of genuine decency. The shock of this realization stayed with them, shaping their attitudes toward the world and toward life itself. Klaus Becker, observing the change in himself and his fellow prisoners, recognized the subtle but undeniable shifts. Conversations during meals became richer, laughter more frequent, and the sense of despair that had accompanied captivity faded. The soldiers were learning that war could not entirely erase humanity, and that respect could exist even amidst conflict. Former enemies began to internalize lessons in empathy, patience, and dignity that would influence their actions long after the camp gates closed. These changes were not limited to the individual. The transformation spread through the camp, influencing group dynamics, cooperation, and morale. The soldiers were becoming participants in a system that valued them as people, and in return they responded with cooperation and respect. By the end of this period, many had undergone a profound internal transformation. Their minds, once hardened by ideology and fear, had begun to open to a reality where enemies could be trusted, respected, and understood. The lessons of the camps extended beyond immediate survival. Former prisoners would carry these experiences for the rest of their lives. Many returned to America after the war, not out of necessity, but out of admiration for a nation that had treated them with dignity in a time of conflict. For Klaus Becker, the realization was simple yet profound. The human capacity for kindness, respect, and empathy could endure even amidst war, and in many cases it could change the hearts and minds of those who had once been conditioned to hate. By the end of this chapter of their lives, the POWs had learned something invaluable, that humanity, even in its smallest acts, could transcend ideology, transform perspectives, and leave a lasting impact that no battle could erase. The California camps had not only held prisoners, they had taught them the most difficult and profound lesson of all, that people, even enemies, could be trusted, respected, and understood. As the war drew closer to its end, Klaus Becker and the other German prisoners began to contemplate the future. For months, they had been exposed to a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. Americans, once thought to be cruel and decadent, had treated them with respect, fairness, and humanity. The lessons learned in the camps were not theoretical. They were lived, repeated every day in small acts of decency, in shared meals, in the trust extended during work assignments, and in moments of recreation. The impact of this treatment became apparent as prisoners prepared to leave. Some returned to Germany, carrying memories that conflicted with their previous beliefs. They had been trained to see America as an enemy, yet they could not deny the kindness they had experienced. Others made a more surprising choice. They chose to return to the United States after the war. Thousands of former POWs immigrated, seeking the opportunities and freedom they had glimpsed behind the fences of the camps. For many, the seeds of admiration planted by small acts of decency had grown into a profound respect for a nation that had treated them as human beings. The beach where Klaus first stood in the Pacific Ocean remained a powerful symbol. For him, the waves were not just water, they represented revelation, transformation, and hope. He remembered the disbelief, the shock, and the tentative joy of those first moments. The same coastline, now part of a California state park, still welcomes tourists each summer. Few realize that 80 years ago, German soldiers stood on the same sands, confronted with the unfamiliar reality of kindness from the enemy. The ocean had shown them something that war could not erase: humanity. The experiences in California's camps also had a broader impact on post-war relations. Former prisoners who returned to Germany often spoke positively of their time in America. Their testimonies helped foster understanding, sometimes acting as informal ambassadors of reconciliation. Men who had been indoctrinated to distrust and hate found themselves advocating for a country that had treated them well. The psychological transformation was remarkable. The human capacity for empathy, once suppressed by ideology, had been awakened through consistent, humane treatment. Even within the camps, small stories carried enormous weight. A soldier recovering from illness marveled at the care of the camp doctors. Another, who had never played sports in his life, discovered joy in a game of soccer under the California sun. Letters sent home cautiously described the surprise of being treated well, yet they could not capture the full depth of the transformation. Every day, every gesture, every wave of the Pacific reinforced the same lesson: humanity could survive, even in war. Klaus Becker often reflected on the cognitive dissonance that had shaped his experience. The propaganda he had been fed for years crumbled under the weight of lived reality. His fellow prisoners shared the same story: suspicion replaced by trust, fear replaced by curiosity, and hatred replaced by understanding. For many, the camps were more than a place of detention. They were a space where ideology collided with reality, and reality won. By the time the gates of the camps opened for the last time, the prisoners had changed in ways that would last a lifetime. They had learned that respect, fairness, and compassion were not weaknesses, but strengths. They had learned that enemies could act with decency, and that such treatment could alter hearts and minds more profoundly than any victory on the battlefield.
Klaus Becker and countless others carried these lessons into the world, shaping relationships, decisions, and the future itself. Even today, the legacy of those camps remains. The stories of German POWs treated with dignity stand as a testament to the power of humanity, showing that even in the darkest times, acts of kindness can create lasting change. For Klaus, the memory of standing in the Pacific Ocean, feeling the cold waves crash against his feet, and seeing the smiles of those who had once been his enemies, remained the most vivid reminder of what war cannot destroy: the enduring potential for human decency. In the end, the California POW camps taught a lesson that transcended national boundaries and political ideology. They proved that when humans choose empathy over cruelty, trust over fear, and respect over prejudice, they can transform not just individuals, but entire generations. Klaus Becker left the camps not just as a survivor of war, but as a witness to the extraordinary power of humanity, a lesson the world desperately needed, and one that resonates even 80 years later.